All right, let's turn to section 91, page 8 on your outline. We have instruction concerning, that should be actually 92, concerning sonship. They come back to Capernaum, and in verse 24, they that received the half shekel came to Peter and said, "Does not your teacher pay the half shekel?" The half shekel was the annual temple tax to support the temple function. That the background is that Romans did not pay taxes. Romans who were citizens were viewed as the sons of the king, and therefore they were free of paying any taxes. And therefore they collected taxes from all of the conquered nations. But Messiah happens to be the Lord of the temple, and believers are his sons, and therefore believers were exempt from paying the temple tax. However, so as not to cause any problem of stumbling, Yeshua said, "We'll go ahead, pay the temple tax." He tells them to go back for his fishing work just for this one occasion. And when he goes fishing, he'll catch a fish. Inside the fish's mouth will be a shekel coin. And that will pay for his tax and Peter's tax. As a result of this incident, if you read around the restaurants of the Sea of Galilee, they always have a fish they call for the tourists St. Peter's fish. It's not the Hebrew name, but that is the English name for the fish. And I've always taken my groups to go to a restaurant that will serve them a nice big, not just a little tourist fish like the tourist gets, but a nice big St. Peter's fish. So over the years, I've eaten many of these fishes. I've never found enough money in the fish to pay my taxes. So it brings us to section 93, lesson on humility. And this incident comes right after the incident for Peter concerning the payment for the tax found in the fish. And furthermore, just soon after, the three received a special vision of the transfiguration. And this may have led to a discussion among them, who among them will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. When the Messianic kingdom is established, who among them will be the greatest? And the main point of section 93 is they need to be childlike. Childlike. And therefore it's a lesson on humility, and there are 6 basic points. Number 1, children have no social status within the home. They know the parents are the ones who rule the house. So secondly, it is necessary to turn to God as a child. And this thirdly should result in a humble spirit. Fourthly, there should be a spirit of receptiveness of the insignificance of a child. And recognize the child is dependent upon his father or his parents. Now, the means of attaining, therefore, greatness in the kingdom is to become like the least as a servant, become like a child. So to gain, not entry, but to gain a higher position in the kingdom, they should come on the basis of childlike faith. Now, section 94, instruction concerning exclusiveness and pride. And the main point of section 94 says in section 93, be more childlike, and now the instructions is to receive those who are childlike. The incident begins, according to Luke verse 49, that they saw someone casting out demons in Yeshua's name, he's not part of the inner circle, and therefore they forbade him to follow this practice. But sure lays down the principle in verse 15, forbid him not, for he that is not against you is for you. And they have now offended that man, and all causes of stumbling need to be removed, otherwise there'll be discipline. But it's especially going to be true of stumbling against children. And it should be recognized that one can accomplish great things for the Messiah without being a member of the inner party. So again, he says what he's taught previously in Luke verse 41, whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink because you're Messiah's, will I send to you, shall not in any wise lose their reward. And the whole point is, in our thinking, we sometimes assume that the rewards are going to go to those who are in greater areas of ministry, like preaching and teaching and pastoring and so on. But the scriptures teach that as long as we do everything we do, even the humblest work, but we do it for the purpose of honoring the Lord, it will be rewarded. Even if you give someone a cup of water in order to bring honor to the Messiah, it will be rewarded. So it's not going to be simply the bigger works. For example, if you have in the congregation, you have your own building, the carpet will need to be cleaned, the windows will need to be washed. If we do this, not because somebody else has to do it, or somebody has to do it, but we do it because we want to bring honor to the Lord and glorify the Messiah, even these small works will not go unrewarded. If you're fixing refreshments and you make coffee, for example, even if you make coffee not because it needs to be done, but because you want to honor the Lord, that also will be rewarded. And there are ways that you can also increase your reward accordingly. For example, if you make real coffee and not instant coffee, the reward's going to go up. Or if you make regular coffee and not decaffeinated coffee, the reward will go up even further. Some of you heard me say this, but to me, coffee without caffeine tastes like a cow's afterbirth. That's how it got its name. When a cow gives birth, she decaffeinates. And then if you serve gourmet coffee, like 100% Kona or Kauai coffee, the reward will go even further. So these are ways you can increase your intake at the judgment seat of the Messiah. So all matters of stumbling should be put away. And even things that are intended for useful work sometimes needs to be put aside to make sure that we don't miss out on the greater element, bringing honor to the Lord. Now, in this section, he also deals with the concept of role of salt. And among the Jewish people, every sacrifice was salted with salt. It was a symbol of the incorruptible and a symbol of the higher. And in Judaism, salt was often compared with the soul, and scriptures were compared with the soul, with the salt. And salt was often a symbol of acuteness. It's also a symbol of God's covenant relationship with Israel, because you have in the Hebrew Bible the concept of a covenant of salt, and the Mosaic covenant was a covenant of salt. And the Talmud specifies the world cannot survive without salt. And salt was often necessary in the ancient world for the purpose of preserving food from getting spoiled. Now, salt from the Dead Sea was a bit, can lose its savory qualities. He mentions the concept, if the salt has lost its saltiness, normally that doesn't happen with salt, but it does happen to some degree with salt out of the Dead Sea. So in verse 50 of Luke's account, salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, wherewith will ye be season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. And just as salt is a preservative, the remnant of Israel that has the salt is the one that preserves the existence of the Jewish people. And just as salt is used for seasoning, having salt between believers makes the quality of life enjoyable. So salt often typifies the quality which is the distinctive mark of a disciple. And the loss of this distinctive mark of a disciple will also end up making his life a bit worthless. Let's go to section 95. Lesson on forgiveness. This is the section that the ecclesia, the Kela, is mentioned the second time in Matthew's gospel, and again, only Matthew mentions this new entity to come up in the future. Now, what he does is spell out the proper procedure for congregational discipline. And in verse 15, if your brother sin against you, go and show him his fault between you and him alone. So the first step should be an individual confrontation. We're not dealing with a moral sin, like in the case of 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 5, where a member of the congregation was sleeping with his stepmother, and the elders were to move immediately to remove this person from the congregation. But in this context, it's more of an individual offense between two believers in the same congregation. And the first step has to be a private confrontation between the offended and the offender. As soon as you started speaking about this outside this first step, it already has lost the right of this kind of steps. Then if he does not respond, then comes the second step. If he hear you, you're against your brother, but if he hears you not, take with you one or two more. Keeping with the principle, the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses can the truth be established. So take one more person, so there's 2 of you. Even better, take 2 more, so there's 2 people besides yourself that can witness to the fact that the offending brother did not respond. And if he still fails to respond, then will come step number 3 in verse 17. If he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. Tell it to the Kela, the ecclesia. And then he'll be confronted by the local congregation. If he still refuses to respond, then Yeshua says at the end of verse 17, let him be unto you as the Gentile and the publican, meaning untouchable. And what that means, he's now going to be removed from the local congregation. In the 4th stage, one then moves into the area of excommunication. And what that means is spelled out in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 5. 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 5. That person who's a believer is now put back under Satan's authority for the destruction of the flesh. The passage goes on to say it does not affect his spiritual salvation. He's now put back under the authority of Satan for destruction of the flesh. As a general rule, Satan has no authority to put any believer to death. And in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 15, 1 Thess 4, 13 through 15, whenever a believer dies, it is the Messiah that puts us to sleep. The one exception to the rule is the believer that has been excommunicated. And in that case, Satan can put him to death. And that is what John talks about in 1 John 5, verses 15 and 16, 1 John 5, 15 and 16. That brothers who live in sin can be prayed for, but if one has already committed the sin unto death, we cease to pray for him. And the sin unto death is whatever sin it was that caused that brother to be excommunicated from the congregation. At that point, he loses the protection of the saints. He loses also the protection of the prayers of the saints. So keep in mind, this is a context of church discipline. So in verse 18, verily I say unto you, whatsoever things soever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever things ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now the point he's making is the binding and loosing again in the realm of church discipline, binding and loosing to punish or not to punish. And if they follow the legitimate order, and it's a correct discipline, then the heaven will remove its protection of the believer, which is why the believer can be put to death by Satan. So again, the church has the right to practice binding and loosing in the area of discipline, but only up to the point of excommunication. An apostle could pass the death sentence, but a non-apostle cannot do that. Now verse 19, again I say unto you, if two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything they shall ask, it shall be done of them of my Father who is in heaven. Now people have very often pulled this verse out of context and made it a prayer verse, and not as it is in the context in the area of church discipline. So people come together and agreed, then it didn't happen. If it didn't happen, they both accused each other of a lack of faith. This is not a blank check permission. So the two people or three people here, notice, are the same two or three witnesses who witnessed to the congregation that the sinning brother has not responded. And verse 20, for the two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. People have pulled this verse to teach, here's how you define a local church. A local church is where two or three people are gathered together. When you have two or three believers gathered together, what you have is two or three believers gathered together. But that's all you have. This is not the local church. So in the context, who are the two or three people gathered together? Again, the two or three people who are witnesses that the sinning brother has not responded. So a text apart from its context is a pretext, and every verse needs to be interpreted by the context where it is found. At this point, Peter speaks up in verse 21, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him until 7 times? And he's being generous if you compare it with Pharisaism. Under Pharisaic law, you're required to forgive someone that sinned against you 3 times. After that, you don't have to forgive him anymore. But Peter doubles the amount of the Pharisees offer and adds 1 more. 7 forgivenesses. But your response, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. You can take it literally. You have to forgive him 490 times, but the focus of the number 7, which means totality and so on. As often as he asks for forgiveness, just as often he needs to be forgiven without counting. Because the very act of counting shows external forgiveness but not internal forgiveness. So somebody comes and offends you and you say, okay, I'll forgive you. That's one. He forgives you, he again does it, so again you respond, all right, I'll forgive you. That's two. Happens a third time, okay, now I'll forgive you one more time. And for Pharisee, that's as far as needs to be forgiving. With Peter, there's four more opportunities to be forgiven. But the very fact of counting how many times this one offended us shows only external forgiveness, but not internal forgiveness. So he goes on to tell a parable about the unforgiving servant. The one servant who owed a lot of money was forgiven. Another servant, the same servant that was forgiven for so much, so another servant owes him very little, and he refuses to be forgiving and gives them even physical abuse. And when the Lord hears about this, he calls in the servant that has not been forgiving. He's reminded how much he himself had been forgiven by the master. And therefore, in verse 34, his Lord was angry, delivered him to the tormentors till he should pay all that was due. And so the application comes in verse 35, so shall my heavenly Father do unto you, if you forgive not everyone his brother from your hearts. And so the lesson of forgiving in this section is three things. Number one, we all have been forgiven from God. And the basis of our forgiveness from God should be the basis of our forgiving another brother. We have been forgiven much and should be willing to also forgive much. Second lesson, the forgiving father should be imitated by his children. And thirdly, an unforgiving person cannot and should not be expected to be forgiven himself. Now keep in mind, this is not dealing with salvational forgiveness. Salvation forgiveness is not based upon any work. It's simply based upon grace through faith. But this is family forgiveness. And family forgiveness is based upon our recognizing we have been forgiven so much, and therefore all who offend us shall also be equally forgiven. Now obviously we cannot extend forgiveness till they request it, but as often as they request it, we should be forgiving, and the willingness to forgive should always be there. Section 96, the challenge by his brothers. It's coming close to the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And keep in mind then the Jewish mindset, already based upon Zechariah 14, verses 16 to 21, that is the feast that will be fulfilled by the Messianic kingdom. You know, he has four half-brothers, but none of his four half-brothers are believers at this stage. As they challenged their half-brother Yeshua to now go into Judah and take your disciples with you, and then openly declare yourself to be the Messiah and essentially erect the Messianic kingdom. And they're saying this, as verse 5 says, for even his brethren did not believe on him. Now he tells them he will not go to the feast, meaning he will not go to the feast in response to their challenge. He's not going to go to the feast for the purpose of erecting the Messianic kingdom. For him, he's already declared the unpardonable sin has been committed. So he will go, but for his own purposes. Section 97, the journey to Jerusalem. Luke verse 51 says, "And it came to pass when days were near come that he should be received up. He steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." Now this is now in the last 6 months of his life. But when he tried to get to Judah, to do so by going through Samaria. As I mentioned earlier, Samaritans never bothered Jews leaving Jerusalem, heading back for Galilee. They were happy to see Jews leaving Jerusalem, but they were often opposed to Jews traveling through their territory to get to Jerusalem, and often attacked them. And Josephus records some events where the Samaritans attacked the Jews heading south. So when he entered into the first Samaritan village going north to south, they did not receive him. And why? Because he was going to Jerusalem, and therefore would not let him pass through Samaria. So 2 disciples who are brothers, James and John has often been referred to as the disciple of love or the apostle of love. But that will be his character later, but not quite yet. And they asked Jesus to allow them to rain fire come down from heaven, and let's wipe these Samaritans out. Instead, the God rebuked, and they're now going to take the long way around by crossing the Jordan River and head south, and then near Jericho, they'll cross back to the west side of the river and head for Jerusalem. It's a longer way around. Well, but this is the only way for them to do so now. In section 98, we have the instruction concerning discipleship. In the first encounter, and in Matthew verse 19, there came a scribe and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you whithersoever you go." But Yeshua's response is, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man had nowhere to lay his head." And the first principle is to count the cost before becoming a disciple. Again, it's not salvation. Discipleship that follows salvation. There must be a self-denial, and there's no assurance of having a comfortable lifestyle. So be willing to count the cost. The second lesson, this is in Luke verse 59, said unto another, "Follow me." He said, "Lord, suffer me to go and bury my father." He said to them, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead, but go you and publish abroad the kingdom of God." And the question raised here, why would Yeshua object from just going back to finish burying his father? But the point is that it's not that the father was already dead, but a firstborn son was to be living nearby, often in the same compound, until the father dies. Then he should bury the father and then still stay for 1 year in the same area to recite the prayer known as the Kaddish, which is not a prayer for the dead, it's a prayer recognizing God's sovereignty of a relative that had died. And therefore, he's delaying the point of becoming a disciple. But once the cost is counted and the commitment made, there should be no delay in fulfilling it. There must be immediate surrender. In the third case, that's in verse 61 of Luke, another also said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first suffer me to bid farewell to them that are at my house." Yeshua said to him, "No man having put try to sever that commitment, the true disciple must simply continue and not involve themselves with those that will try to hold them back and try to keep him from fulfilling the commitment to discipleship. And so in connection with some three previous discipleship lessons, in the first case, he was too quick, too hasty, and he must fulfill the previous admonition, let him deny himself. The second one was too slow, too hesitating, and he needs to learn the second principle, let him take up his cross. In the third section, he made things too easy, he was undeciding, and the admonition he needs to fulfill is, let him follow me. Now the fifth main division of his life is going to be the Roman numeral 5, the opposition to the king. Now what we've seen previously, the leaders have rejected him, and the people in general don't know which way to go. They're like the sheep without a shepherd. But now what we shall begin to see in this section is that the people begin to follow the leaders. The people will begin to follow the leaders, and they'll begin to reject him and even repeat the accusation of the Pharisaic leaders that he does these things by the power of Beelzebub. And the Beelzebub accusation is going to be seen several times. Now the motif for this section that we shall see several times is, and there was a division. That'll be the basic motif. And there was a division. In section 99, is the conflict at the Feast of Tabernacles. Notice on page 8, you have a specific 7-point outline. And what's going to be on the screen is simply following these 7 points. So the first point is going to be Messiah's authority is questioned in verses 11 through 15. Now, during the time of the Second Temple, at the Feast of Tabernacles, there were two major rituals. The first major ritual is the rejoicing at with the drawing of the water. And every day for 7 days, the priesthood came down from the temple compound all the way to the bottom part of the city of David with the pool of Siloamus. And there they would fill up pitchers of water. And then they would march back to the temple compound, walking through the outer court. Now going from the outer court to the inner court, there'd be 15 steps. They would then stay in the first step and sing Psalm 120. Second step, Psalm 121, so on, till they sang Psalms 120 to 134. That's why in the Psalm number you'll see this little phrase, a song of ascents. A song of ascents, that's what they sang as they ascended these 15 steps. They would then go into the inner court and pour out the water at the base of the altar, and that will be followed by great rejoicing. And the Mishnah says this, he that has not seen the rejoicing at the drawing of the water has not seen rejoicing all of his life. Now the rabbinic interpretation of this ritual, that this represented the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the last days upon Israel, and 4 times in the Hebrew scriptures that prophesied the outpouring of the water upon the whole nation. We saw a couple of these in the book of Isaiah earlier. And this outpouring of the Spirit will be Israel's national salvation that will then allow them to enter into the Messianic kingdom. The second key element ceremony was the kindling of the lampstands, and both in the inner and outer court they would have these large lampstands, each one having 4 lamps. And the ones known as the junior priests were those that were being trained for the priesthood between the ages of 25 and 30, would stand on ladders, and as they started to get dark, they would light these lampstands. And the Mishnah says there was so much light coming out of the temple compound, the light came to every courtyard all over Jerusalem. Now, the rabbinic interpretation of the second ceremony is that this represented the Shekhinah, the Shekinah glory. Now, Yeshua is going to respond to both of these key ceremonies. And I'll point out when he does so. Now, you find the term Jews used frequently in this section, but the way the word Jews is used, especially in John's Gospel, it's used 73 times in John's Gospels, but based upon context, it means three different things. Sometimes it meant Jews in general, like in John chapter 4, salvation is of the Jews. Sometimes it means Judeans in contrast to Galileans, Judeans in place of Galileans. But thirdly, it sometimes focuses more specifically on the Jewish leaders. Now, what we're going to see here in this section, this is the fourth of John's 7 discourses, the discourse on the waters of life. And we see there is division among the masses. The masses already know the elders and rulers have rejected him. And verse 11 says, the Jews therefore sought him at the feast. And the reason they would seek him is because the Feast of Tabernacles is to be fulfilled by the Messianic kingdom, and they're assuming maybe this will be the actual Feast of Tabernacles when the kingdom will be set up. The disciples, as we shall see, that's what they're anticipating. And you see the division in verse 12. Some said he's a good man, others say not so, but leads the multitude astray. In verse 13, yet no man spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Here the word Jews is used specifically of the Jewish leaders. Now they find him finally at the midpoint of the feast in verse 14. And listening to him, they raised the question in verse 15. They marvel, saying, how know this man letters never having been learned? The challenge is he didn't study any of the yeshivas, any of the schools of the rabbis. Therefore, how come he can speak what he speaks and teach what he teaches? The second segment is Messiah's explanation in chapter 7, verses 16 to 24. And he'll make a twofold claim. His teaching is God received. He was taught by God himself to teach what he teaches. And secondly, he was also sent by God to teach. So what he's teaching didn't originate with him, it originated with God the Father. Secondly, he points out in this section, it is their own failure to keep the law. And why are they failing to keep the law? He points out in verses 19 and 20, because they're intent on killing him. And notice now in verse 20, the multitude, not just the leaders, but the multitude said, you have a demon. And now notice the accusation of being demonized is coming from the multitudes. They're being to accept the leader's explanation. But he points out what he's been doing is not the result of being demonized. It's their own lack of obedience. In verses 21 to 24, one of their problems is how they misinterpret what it means to keep the Sabbath. And furthermore, if the 8th day of a boy's life falls on the Sabbath day, the law of circumcision supersedes the law of the Sabbath, and the lad will be circumcised even if the 8th day happens to be a Sabbath day. So if it's allowed to mutilate on the Sabbath, because that's what basically circumcision does, why is it wrong to heal on the Sabbath day? The third section, now they question his person in verses 25 to 27. And the problem is they are aware of his physical origin, but they are not aware of his divine origin. And the leaders, notice the people understand that the leaders want to kill him in verse 25. And in verse 26, they raise the question, can it be that the rulers indeed know that this is the Messiah, but are not willing to accept him as the Messiah? And that brings Messiah's explanation in verses 28 to 30. And what he says here, number one, you know my human origin, but secondly, you don't know my divine origin. And by claiming to have some divinity, verse 30, they sought therefore to take him, and Norman laid his hand on him because his hour was not yet come. And here again, every time they tried to put him to death prematurely, before the proper time in the proper way, these attempts always fail. Now, section 5, the people's response in verses 31 through 36. On one hand, you see faith in verse 31 on the part of some individuals. Some do believe. But the Pharisees, hearing the multitude murmuring, this is the other side of the equation, they send the chief priests, who are the Sadducean members, and the Pharisees, who are the other members of Sanhedrin, send the temple police officers to have him arrested. As also in these contexts, he announces he'll be soon departing them. But again, speaking parabolically, they don't understand this. And so in verse 36, what is this word that he said, you shall seek me, you shall not find me, that where I am, you cannot come? Again, he teaches, but he uses terminology which they do not understand. Section 6, Messiah's invitation. Now, verse 37 provides the timing. On the last day, the great day of the feast, this would be the 7th day. On the first 6 days, when they brought the water from the pool of Siloam or Shiloah to the inner court, before they poured out, they would march once around the altar, but on the 7th day, they would march around 7 times around the altar. And this is the occasion they would begin praying for the rain season to begin. They wait until the 7th day for the special prayers for rain, because if Jews had to live in these flimsy boots, if they prayed the first day and God answered the prayer on the first day, they'd be rained out. So they wait till the last day to begin praying for rain. And so the point is that on the 7th day, there were special prayers focusing on water. In light of that, notice verse 37. He cried, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believes on me, as the scripture has said, from within him shall flow rivers of living water. But this spoke he of the Spirit, which they that believed on him were to receive. For the Spirit was not yet given, because Yeshua was not yet glorified. Like the rabbis, he does connect the outpouring of the water ceremony with the Holy Spirit, but he gives it an individual application. The time is coming where every individual believer will be indwelt by the Holy Spirit. It has not happened yet. Only a few had been indwelt, but it was not open to all believers. That will happen only as of Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. But the Spirit was not yet given because Yeshua was not yet glorified. He'll be glorified with his final ascension to heaven and to be seated at the right hand of God the Father. But here again, notice the division. Verse 40, some of the multitude, therefore, when they heard these words, says, this is of a truth the prophet. Others, this is the Messiah. So some believe he's the prophet, Deuteronomy 18. Others are more specific, crucial for salvation. They believe him to be the Messiah. Others say, will the Messiah come out of Galilee? Does not the scripture say, the Messiah comes from the seed of David and from Bethlehem? So they assume he was born in Nazareth, not realizing he was born in Bethlehem. And so you see that motif in verse 43, so there arose a division in the multitude because of him. As for others, some were taken him, but no one was able to do so. Again, the failure of trying to cause a premature death. Now in the 7th section, verses 45 to 52, you have the Pharisaic response. They send out police officers to arrest him, but these police officers come back empty-handed. And so they're asked in verse 45, why did you not bring him? And they answer, never man so spoke, in verse 46. They were very impressed by what he had to say, but they didn't understand what he had to say. And now they're being scolded. And in verse 47, the Pharisees therefore answered them, are ye also led astray? Have any of the rulers believed on him, or of the Pharisees? It's like Jewish people today. If he's the Messiah, how come our rabbis don't believe on him? Already they're using the argument, did any of us Pharisees believe on him? The trouble with the multitude is 49, this multitude that knows not the law are accursed. Well, they know the Torah, the Mosaic law pretty well, but they're refusing also to follow strictly Pharisaic law. And referred to in Hebrew as Am Ha'aretz, the people of the land, but it's a negative phrase. And Hillel says, no one among the Am Ha'aretz is righteous. No one among the common people, the Am Ha'aretz, is righteous. What they don't realize is there's one Pharisee that has begun moving, not yet a believer, the one we met previously, Nakdimon or Nicodemus. So what he does, what he tells them, verse 51, does our Lord judge a man except to first hear from himself and know exactly what he does? And they rather answer emotionally, are you also a Galilean? Search and see. Out of Galilee arises no prophet. That's no statement. Most prophets were not from Galilee, but 3 prophets were. Hosea was from the Galilee, Jonah was from the Galilee, and Elisha was from the Galilee. Now, section 100, the conflict over the law. What happens here is the one singular attempt the Pharisees make to get Yeshua to say something that would contradict the Mosaic law. As we saw previously, the only time they have anything to accuse him of is breaking Mishnaic law, the oral law. He readily admits breaking Mishnaic law. He only affirms following the Mosaic law. So here's the one attempt they make to get him to say something that would contradict the Mosaic law. And so they're waiting until he can be seen in public. They want to discredit him publicly. And in verse 2, early in the morning, he came again into the temple, And all the people came unto him, and he sat down. Again, notice that little Jewish background. You always teach in a sitting position. He sat down and taught them. And in verse 3, the Pharisees and scribes bring to him a woman taken adultery. And they point out to Yeshua that this woman is guilty of adultery, and to let him know that there is no doubt about her guilt, they say that she was caught in the very act of adultery. Now the text shows that they were saying this that they might have something whereof to accuse him. Well, that's also when they gave themselves away. They said that she was caught in the very act of adultery. The problem is you cannot be caught in the act of adultery unless there's at least two people involved. You can be singularly accused of it, to be caught in the very act of it has to be at least two people. So where is the male counterpart to this relationship? And in California, where I used to live, that would be usually three or more. So where is the male counterpart to this relationship? But that's not really what their goal is. So in verse 5, they say, now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such. What then do you say of her? And the Greek here is a little bit more emphatic. Now Moses said to stone such, but you, what do you say we should do? This is what Moses said. But you, what do you do? What do you say we should do? And again, an obvious attempt to entrap him by violating a Mosaic commandment. Now, initially, Jesus chooses not to answer. He simply says he stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground, and when they press him for an answer, he finally gives him one, and then for the second time, verse 8, he stooped down and wrote with his finger on the ground. I always found it rather interesting how many commentaries tried to tell us what he was writing on the ground. As if after 2,000 years there's something left in the dust that could still decipher. In Greek, however, the emphasis is not on the writing, it's on the finger. Now, in Greek, you can say the same thing in different ways, but the point you want to emphasize, you put in front of the sentence, and in Greek grammar it's called the emphatic position. And what's in the emphatic position is not the writing, but the finger. Literally, the text says in Greek, with the finger, he wrote on the ground. So why is the emphasis specifically on the finger? Of the 613 commandments God gave to Moses, 603 written on parchment with the pen of a man. But 10 were inscribed into tablets of stone. The ones inscribed in tablets of stone included the rule against adultery. Furthermore, we're told 4 different times the 10 commandments were not chiseled out with the chisel of a man, but 4 different times they're inscribed with the very finger of God. If you want them, the 4 passages are Exodus chapter 31, verse 18, Exodus 31, 18, or chapter 32, verses 15 to 17, 32, 15 to 17. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, Deuteronomy 4:13, and chapter 9, verse 10, 9:10. So the focus is that he knows exactly what the law of Moses says about this sin and its punishment, but he knows everything the law of Moses says about the sin and punishment. Now the answer he gave them in verse 7, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And often people pull this verse out of context and claim what this teaches is we should never judge anyone else because we're all sinners. and therefore we should not be judgmental. But this is the context of the Mosaic Law. And the Mosaic Law did not teach that the witnesses had to be sinlessly perfect before they can serve as accusing witnesses. Because if he was teaching we should not judge anyone, then this would violate the Mosaic Law. And this would be a basis for accusing him of breaking the Mosaic Law. So if he was saying only if you're sinlessly perfect should you cast the first stone, then that would violate the Mosaic Law. But again, the point is that he knows everything the Mosaic Law says about the sin and its punishment. And yes, the Mosaic Law does say anyone guilty of adultery must be stoned to death. But that's not all that Moses said. Moses also said that nobody could be stoned to death except at the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And this much they have at least, because they do claim she was caught in the very act. But even then, that's not all that Moses said. Moses also said it is the 2 or 3 witnesses. After his testimony, one is stoned to death. It is they who must cast the first stone. The first stone must be cast by the 2 or 3 witnesses. There's also one more point. This is where some rabbinic addition came into being. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 13 and chapter 17, Deuteronomy chapters 13 and 17, it deals with the principle that witnesses must be themselves innocent. Witnesses must be themselves innocent. In rabbinic interpretation, that means the witnesses must not be guilty of the same sin. That's the rabbinic part, not the Mosaic part. The witnesses must not be guilty of the same sin. So what he's saying is, if the 2 or 3 witnesses are valid witnesses, let them cast the first stone just like Moses said. In other words, he affirms the law of Moses here. That's what Moses said, let the 2 or 3 witnesses cast the first stone, so proceed to cast the first stone, just like Moses said. And one by one, they scroll away. The implication, at least among the accusers, they were not innocent of the same sin. And perhaps standing among them was the one with whom she supposedly was caught in the very act. So after a while, she's left alone. And he asked in verse 10, "Woman, where are they? Did no man condemn you?" In verse 11, she said, "No man, Lord." So he answers, "Neither do I condemn you." He's not excusing her sin. He wants her from henceforth sin no more. He's not excusing her, but this was to be a legal condemnation based upon the Mosaic law. And because the 2 or 3 witnesses were not willing to cast this first stone, there was no legal basis of condemning her. This was the one single attempt, as I said, to get them to violate some point of the Mosaic law, and it fails. They will not try this ploy again. They'll now go back to the accusations of breaking Mishnaic law. They cannot fault him violating any Mosaic law. Now, section 101. Now, taking 101 and 102 together, and this will become the 5th of John 7 discourses, the discourse on the light of the world. We also will see here the 2nd of John 7 I ams, and this 101, that's in verse 12, "I am the light of the world." And following that, you'll see another example of the sub-theme of the conflict of light and darkness that is prominent in John's Gospel. And here we see the response to the second ceremony of tabernacles. I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life. And we're bringing interpretation, again, the kindling of the lampstands was a symbol of the Shekinah light, and he now identifies himself as being that Shekinah light. And the Pharisees come attacking verse 13. You bear witness of yourself, your witness is not true. You alone have borne witness to yourself, and therefore it's not valid. His response is, first of all, his testimony is true by virtue of his divine origin. Secondly, their judgment upon him is wrong. He says, because you do not know the Father, and because you do not know the Father, you do not recognize who I am, and so your judgment is wrong. And thirdly, he presents the twofold witness to his claims. Number one, he proclaims himself to be the Messiah, and secondly, the Father has proclaimed him to be the Messiah. And furthermore, to know the Messiah is to know the Father. Now, verse 20, this he spoke in the temple treasury area, and no man took him. Any attempt for premature death will fail, in other words, because his hour was not yet come. Now, section 102, the conflict over his person. If you're not on page 9 yet, you should be. Under point 1, Messiah is the true object of faith. And what he does, again, teaching parabolically in terms that they cannot understand, he says, number one, he will depart to a place where they cannot follow. And secondly, they will end up dying in their sins. Thirdly, I am from above, but you are from beneath. Fourthly, you need to believe that I am, lest you die in your sins. And identifies himself as the I am, who spoke to Moses, I am that I am. Fifthly, I was sent from the Father. Sixthly, ultimately, I will be your final judge. And seventh, you will crucify me. Now the second part is Messiah is the true deliverer. He delivers them from sin, but only if they believe on him. He also is the true deliverer from Satan, but only if they reject the father of lies, and that is Satan. He's the true deliverer from death, and those who believe on him would not see death, meaning they will never die spiritually. They may die physically, but they will not die spiritually. So in dealing, first of all, with his deliverance part, he points out their father is the devil. And the devil has blinded them so that they cannot understand. He goes on to say the devil is the originator of lies and murders. The first lie was done in Genesis 3. He's responsible for it. He's also the murderer. Because of his temptation, people die. He goes on to say that his audience are liars because of what they say of me, and therefore they're being influenced by Satan, the father of lies. And he calls them also murderers, because you seek to kill me. And he's the father of murder. So it concludes, since you do the works of Satan, you are Satan's children. Also, this issues a challenge. Notice in verse 45, which of you convicts me of sin? Can they find one sin that he's guilty of based upon the Mosaic law, not based upon Mishnaic law? Now, this is the response in verse 48. The Jews answered and said to him, say we not well that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? And what would be the connection? It falls back on rabbinic demonology. In Hebrew, calling him a Samaritan would be you're a Shomroni. But Shomroni was also a name of someone of the demonic hierarchy in Judaism. And Shomron was the father of Ashmedai. And Ashmedai became the father of Satan. So what they're saying, by calling him a Samaritan in connection with being demonized, you are a child of the devil and you have a demon. You are a child of the devil and you have a demon. And notice now the accusation of being demonized is just coming from the people in general. They're beginning to accept the Pharisaic explanation. And then in verse 52, the Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Look how often they're beginning to say he's demonized. And why is he demonized? Because he's saying, if a man keep my word, he shall never taste death. Again, he's speaking parabolically. They're not getting the message. So who do you claim to be? He answers, I am the one whom the Father glorifies. And secondly, I am the one who knows the Father. And thirdly, I am the one Abraham sought. Which again emphasizes his pre-existence. And they respond to, you're not even 50 years old yet. Have you really seen Abraham? He was roughly about 36 at this stage. And now he answers, verily, this is verse 58, verily, verily I say unto you, before Abraham was born, I am. And again, saying the I am the way he did, he identifies himself with the I am that I am, the way God introduced himself to Moses. He doesn't say before Abraham was born, I was, but I am. Eternal existence, a clear assertion of deity. And they respond immediately to what he just said. In verse 59, they took up stones to throw it at him. But he was able to remove himself from the temple because his hour was not yet come, and he will only allow himself to die at the proper time in the proper way. Okay, we'll stop here, and we're going to pick this up in this evening.